Hi, joining us on this episode of KSLA Investigates Cold Cases is Chris Bordelon with the Shreveport Police Department. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we want to talk about the Luther Michel case, brutally killed in 1991. Really hasn't been a whole lot of movement over the years. What can you tell us about that case?
Well, I mean, I can say, 1991 is a really long time ago. There's only, I believe, two police officers left at the Shreveport Police Department that were actually here, one of those being Chief Wayne Smith, when that murder occurred. And there were some specific challenges that those investigators went through. They after reviewing the reports and going back over what they did a pretty good job of interviewing suspects and interviewing the witnesses and whatnot. However, they were just never quite able to piece together an arrest in that case.
Do you know if there are any suspects in that case?
Yeah, there were definitely some suspects. Obviously, with it being a brutal, violent murder like it was, a stabbing, we tend to look at those closest to you in those incidents. Typically, because that is when we see stabbings, that usually has a domestic side to things like that. I believe the wife at the time was interviewed multiple times by detectives, and at one point in time was a suspect in that case. However, no arrests were ever made.
So can you take us back to that day for what you do know about the facts in that case?
Well, what I can say is that the the victim in this case, Mr. Michel, had a son and a daughter. The son was currently living with him, but had been staying with the sister at that point in time, or Mr. Michel's daughter. And they were showing back up at the residence, and that's when they located him on the floor in what was described as a pretty gruesome crime scene. He was, later found to have been stabbed multiple times, including the fatal stab wound, which was to the neck. At that point in time, the sister, Mr. Michel's daughter, contacted 911 and contacted for emergency services. And two bypassers, people walking through the neighborhood, actually responded and came in and attempted to do life-saving measures. But ultimately, one of them did have some medical training and was able to determine at that point in time that Mr. Michel was dead and had been dead for quite some time.
They believe it was a couple of days, correct?
At least a few hours, if
Few
not
hours,
a day.
okay.
And
Okay.
that was one of the initial. There was neighborhood statements from the neighbor who had seen the vehicle that Mr. Michel drove, had left the night prior to, and obviously Mr. Michel was not in it, or we don't believe him to have been in it, as he was found murdered the next day. So his vehicle was then found the following day in a apartment complex parking lot, abandoned. And officers did what they could to process that vehicle. They did find what was believed to be the victim's blood inside of the vehicle, possibly having been transferred from the suspect in the homicide. And we did what we could at that point in time with physical evidence. However, DNA testing in 1991 was nowhere near capable of what it is today. So it's one of those situations where, if this case would have happened today, we would have possibly had more leads we could have followed up on. Obviously, there was no cell phones, so some of the, technical and forensic evidence that we are able to accrue today, we just didn't have the capabilities of taking in 1991.
We talked to the daughter around 10 years ago on the 23rd, 24th anniversary of that case. She believes that he was robbed as well. Do you know if anything was taken out of the house as far as you know?
Yes, there were some stereo equipment. Mr. Michel was known to be a DJ. There was some stereo equipment missing, as well as his vehicle, and that stereo equipment was never recovered. So, it could have been a robbery, and that was one of the reasons why we were never able to make an arrest on a possible family member. Is there were just facts and circumstances of the case that didn't really line up in a way that we would see in some domestic incidents.
So how do you go back now, 30 years later and start investigating this? What are some things you could do?
Well, so what and we actually have done this. We went back through and just tried to determine what evidence we still have, physical evidence that remains. The Shreveport Police Property Room holds on to evidence for decades and decades, and we do still have some of the evidence that was initially seized that day. Now we're trying to determine if any of it meets the standard that we could do any forensic testing on. However, there are specific challenges, especially if you're talking about DNA testing from 30 years old and the way that it was stored, as well as uh, pushing together a DNA match and making an arrest in a case that long ago, is if it was someone involved in the family, if it was a wife or a relative, could be problematic, is that they would have had a reason to be inside of the residence other than to commit the homicide.
So that's something that you guys are doing, is trying to go back and look for that evidence.
Yes, I
Okay.
actually pulled this case a few weeks ago, and we were going through and determining how much of the evidence is still in our property room. Just to put things into perspective, people don't really have any idea, but the Shreveport Police Property Room is a gigantic building. I would equate it to the size of a Sam's or a Walmart, in which there's evidence from, you know, half. Half a century ago that still exists in that property room, and we hold it for these specific cases because there is no statute of limitation on murder.
Well, have y'all been able to talk to the family? Have they been in contact recently?
Yes, we spoke with actually his daughter, I believe 2 or 3 weeks ago, and explained to her where we were with this case. And obviously, there's many cold cases in our city, and we want to do everything we can to do right by the victims and the victims' families. You reach a certain point in time where we really are just reliant on someone bringing us some new information to the case. We are 100% confident that someone knows who killed Mr. Michel. And, this many years later, maybe something was said to a person that could relay that information to us now, that could allow us to further this investigation and ultimately get justice for this victim.
If someone does have information, how do they contact y'all?
They can contact the Shreveport Police Department at 673-7300, and it'll be the investigative unit. They will be the one handling this case, and we really are seeking any information. And with it having been this amount of time that passed, it is possible that the suspect in this case could be deceased and possibly said something to a relative on their deathbed or something like that. So we really want to close this case and just give the victim's family some closure.
Mr. Borlon, thanks so much.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for doing what you can to keep these cases alive.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.